Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Dan Libenson. He's the founder and executive director of Judaism Unbound. He is also the co-host of the Judaism Unbound podcast and the Oral Talmud videocast. Libenson was executive director of the University of Chicago Hillel for 6 years and director of new initiatives at Harvard Hillel for 3 years. Enjoy my conversation with Dan Libenson. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. We recently became friends and have had some private, very interesting conversations. I'm excited to do this with you on the record, so to speak. But before we get into the juicy knit and grit of everything, why don't you give us some background about you, where you're from, where you were born and raised, everything that ultimately led to what you're doing today.
It's hard to think about how to tell one story in like the most succinct and also useful way, but I tend to tell it more or less this way: that I grew up in Long Island, New York. My dad was a conservative rabbi, and then when I was 14, the year after my bar mitzvah, our family moved to Israel, and I didn't want to go. And I recently had a realization, actually, that my parents promised me that if I moved to Israel, that I would get a dog. And I realized that that was kind of like Abraham and Sarah, where God promises them that if they go to Israel, they'll get a son. And both promises were kind of delayed in terms of when they actually were fulfilled. But that's another story, another trauma. So we moved to Israel when I was 14. And in Israel, my dad, I guess my parents, because they figured that my dad was a rabbi and we were kind of religious, and they thought that you could only be religious or not religious in Israel. Like, it was binary. They put us into the religious school system. So I ended up going to this basically Orthodox high school, and we weren't Orthodox, and I didn't grow up that way. And so that was a shock too. So I often tell that story, that I had these 3 formative Jewish experiences: that I grew up as a conservative rabbi's son in New York, that we moved to Israel when I was 14, and I went to high school in an Orthodox high school. And I experienced all of those basically negatively. And I had a pretty negative sense of my Jewish experience. And yet I was a smart kid and a pretty well-behaved kid. And so I paid attention in school and I learned a lot, but I didn't like it, and I didn't really feel connected to it. And then I don't know what would have happened. Our part of our deal in moving to Israel was that I would go to college in America, and I was all set to do that. And then somehow this book appeared in my dad's possession. I think one of the people in the synagogue lent it to him, and it had just come out. It was called Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. And it was this popularized version of academic biblical criticism. And the bottom line was that the answer was not God. And I already at that point perceived of myself as kind of not a believer, or not somebody who was towing the party line as I understood it. But I never thought that there was a positive alternative to what I had. I only saw it as negative. So I saw, like, I'm not this, I don't like this, I don't believe this. When I read Who Wrote the Bible, that basically was about the history of ancient Israel and why people would have been motivated to write these stories or edit together these stories in a different way. And it was all because of political needs and history and different characters and trying to get 2 populations to create one community together. I was like, all of a sudden, that's something that I can believe in. And for me, that was the big turnaround, was that all of a sudden I had a positive way of being Jewish. And actually my positive way for being Jewish was something that at least the community that I came from generally regarded as a negative thing, as a frightening thing, the idea that we should be exposed to this kind of material. And for me, it was actually the source of a meaningful Judaism. So we could talk about more details, but the long and the short of it was that was what set me off on the trajectory of saying that people who are disengaged from Judaism, it may just be because they have not been offered and they haven't recognized a Judaism that they could embrace. And what can we do? What can I do to try to make it possible for there to be many Jewish avenues and many different Judaisms that people could potentially find, as opposed to some notion that there should just be one and that there's a right way and a wrong way and it's all about marketing. I've said it in other ways too, that I think that one of the things that we often think is that Judaism has a marketing problem as opposed to a product problem. And again, I think that's something we can talk about more. But that's basically where I came into this from.
A lot to unpack there. So let's go step by step here. So, you talked about that people haven't necessarily found, I would say both Jewish and non-Jewish, and I think you would agree, sort of a Judaism that they can embrace. I'm just curious from a personal standpoint, what is the Judaism that you currently embrace?
I would call it a Judaism of discovery. I've called it a Judaism of the wilderness, because I don't think that I can yet say what the sort of fully formed version of Judaism is that I might embrace. I sometimes wonder whether there maybe isn't one. And maybe actually what I do, and maybe we could think about whether a Judaism of constant experimentation and discovery is actually a legitimate form of Judaism for the long term. And it's not that we're trying to discover something that eventually will become the new stable form of Judaism, which is sometimes how I talk about it. But I sometimes wonder if maybe in our times of great change and times of rapid discoveries, that maybe we don't need to be looking for a new version of Judaism, but actually a more dynamic type of Jewish living where it's changing all the time, like other cultures. Like, what does it mean to be any culture? Part of what a healthy culture is doing, I think, is changing all the time. So I'm not entirely sure. We could talk about some of the details. But I guess what I'm saying is that I kind of know what the Judaism that I want to have, or that I do have, what it's not. I can say what it's not. And the reason why I think the metaphor of the wilderness is apt is because the idea of an exodus, of leaving Egyptian Judaism behind, to me, that's the first step. Like, the first step to finding something new is you have to leave the old. And I think that there's a lot of fear of leaving the old, and I understand that fear. I happen not to have that fear, but I don't judge anybody who does have that fear. But I'm looking to get my band of people who are ready to go out. And then the question is, when you leave, are you leaving it as a rejection? Because I think a lot of people that leave Judaism functionally are consciously or unconsciously rejecting it and aren't looking for a new Judaism to be part of. They just don't like it and they want to get out of here. And again, I understand that and I respect that as well. I'm neither of those things, right? I'm not somebody who's trying to stay behind in the old way. And I'm also not somebody who's trying to leave Judaism. I'm somebody who's trying to reimagine Judaism. One of my great rebbes these days is Marie Kondo, the tidying up expert, because I think that she has this like brilliant idea of how do you tidy up your house. And her idea is that basically, if your house is messy, if you're a hoarder, if your house is so full of all this stuff, it actually makes it impossible for you to appreciate the stuff that's really, really great. And so her process is actually to take everything out of every drawer in every closet, make a huge pile of it, and then sort through it and decide what really should I continue to take with me on my journey. And that's how I regard Judaism. It's like, I think there's incredible treasures, but I also think there's a lot of stuff that we can't really realistically continue to take with us. And if we're not willing to go through that process of sifting through it, if we somehow feel that that's a betrayal or that's a breaking of the chain or whatever it might be, then I actually feel like that resistance is ultimately what's going to put Judaism into a tailspin, because most of us are not going to be able to, or it's not really a question of ability, because I don't think it's a good thing. Like, I don't think that we should be able to. I think it's good to be able to reimagine periodically, and it's necessary. And so, that's what I'm saying. Like, I personally love that process of saying everything's on the table. Let's play around with it. Let's experiment. I also understand that that's not for everybody.
So let's talk about that table, right? What are some of the things that you would leave on the table? We'll get to the things that you would take off to as well, but let's start with the things that you say, you know what, this has been around and this shouldn't go anywhere. What are some of those things for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many that it's hard to just kind of, you worry that if the ones that you talk about, people start to say, oh, you're all about just that. And I'm like, okay, there's actually so many, but I'll give you one example. For me, the idea that the Jews have had a history of being oppressed, and we come out of that history of oppression and this starts in the Torah, and I think it's carried through all of Jewish history, that our takeaway from our experience of oppression is that we have a calling to be the people in the world who fight oppression the most against others. It's a sort of pay it forward mentality. And to me, that is, I don't want to say it's unique. I mean, there could be other peoples that have been oppressed that have had the same conclusion. I'm not saying that Jews are the only ones, but it happens to be something that I think has been an inherent part of Judaism from the beginning. And I appreciate that very much. It makes me want to be part of a community of people that says we were oppressed, and our response is not to, build higher walls and make sure that we are never oppressed again. Of course, we should care for ourselves and try not to be oppressed if we can avoid it. But that our great principle is that we have to love the widow and the orphan and the stranger because you were a stranger in a foreign land, right? To me, that is a very exciting principle to hold on to. That's one example.
How does that come to life today, would you say, for your version of Judaism and for Judaism Unbound and stuff like that?
Well, I think that it's a great question, and it's a complex question, because I think that there are a lot of Jews who don't really see themselves as having Judaism being their most important part of their identity or the most important part of their daily life, who fundamentally agree with the principle that I just laid out, but their perception is that those Jews who are more connected, who are more religious, let's say, or who are more affiliated, that's not their core principle. And so as a result, they say, well, I have this unique, or not unique, but I have this idea of what I think Judaism is about, but apparently that's not what the mainstream Jewish institutions are all about. And so therefore I'm going to check out. So I think you end up with a silent majority of Jews who actually do fundamentally understand and love the principle that I just laid out, but there aren't so many institutions that are at their core organized around that principle. And so over time, what I hope that we are doing through Judaism Unbound and some of our fellow travelers is trying to kind of recollect those people who have drifted off and are in different directions and say, let's rally around, for example, that idea. Let's reimagine a Judaism built around that core principle, which I think is a very authentic Judaism, and others. So, I think that the issue from my perspective is that there isn't really yet an organized alternative to the set of mainstream institutions that we all know and sometimes love and sometimes don't love. And I've been very attracted to the set of ideas that comes from the business world called disruptive innovation, or the innovator's dilemma by Clayton Christensen. That's a book. And the example that I like to use is photography, is the idea that photography is healthier and more ubiquitous than it ever has been before. But the companies that define photography for most of its history are functionally gone, Kodak and Polaroid. And the reason why that happens is because the early version of digital photography took kind of bad pictures. And so people looked down on it and said, that's not a worthy alternative to film photography. And they said that at their peril, because eventually the pictures got better and better and better. And by the time digital photography photos were good enough to be really legitimate competitors, the other companies had already brought that to market successfully, and the old ones couldn't catch up. And that's kind of what I'm trying to say about Judaism, is that I actually think I'm the first to say that the alternative version of Judaism that I might be able to present today is not as good as the 2,000-year version that has, that's what we call rabbinic Judaism. How could it be? It's much newer and hasn't had enough time to figure things out and to gel, and it hasn't had the resources. But that's not a reason to say that it won't get there eventually. So again, I don't imagine that everybody's going to come along at this stage. And I don't want them to. I want them to be happy. So if they are more happy where they are, they should stay there. But I think that there's a lot of people who have left the old version of Judaism who don't yet have a rallying point around a new place. But I think that's starting to happen slowly but surely.
I love the photography metaphor simile, because what you're saying, and you turned me on to that book by Clayton Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma. What you're saying here is that photography has gone through an evolution and a revolution. When I think of the most successful photography company in the world, it's Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're saying through your initiative with Judaism Unbound and the podcast and on Yeshiva, which we'll get to, Instagram is the perfect example of, I think, the Judaism that you and myself would like to see, which is Instagram is the same app for you, me, and everyone else. But what's not the same is what you see on your Instagram and what I see on mine, which is based on Instagram's algorithm, which is based on the information that you and I volunteer when we use the app. What we engage with, what we follow, who we follow, how much time we spend on this photo, on that video. And so the algorithm is constantly learning us and then delivering what they call the feed according to your interest, my interest. So when people look at your Instagram or your daughter's Instagram or your mother's Instagram, they're going to have three very different Instagram experiences, all within the same app, the same general features, the same use cases, etc. We can all post, we can all browse, we can all create a profile, but the experience, the content, if you will, the programming varies from person to person. That's why I love what you're talking about, because I think that's ultimately where you and I certainly agree, is that Judaism moving forward, we both talk about the future of Judaism in different ways. It's each person's going to have their own unique Jewish experience and journey. And something's going to have to enable that, right? I think what you were saying in more or less words is that the existing Jewish infrastructure, the institutions and the organizations and so forth, cannot accommodate, literally cannot accommodate, based on their organizational setup and infrastructure, cannot accommodate individualized Jewish journeys at scale. Just not doable. Or they'd have to gut the whole thing and build it from the ground up, which we know them not to be so interested in doing. And that's fine. They don't have to. But I think what we're talking about, and again, both for the Jews and non-Jews, meaning people that are not Jewish but interested in Judaism for different reasons. Maybe they married a Jew, maybe they have Jewish friends, maybe they, like at Izzy, we get people all the time who write us, hey, I'm not Jewish, but I happened to be in Israel randomly in 1974 on a kibbutz, haven't been back since, and Izzy is a great way to see the modern day Israel. Like, those people also want to have Jewish journeys and experiences, but they're not going to find them in the traditional organizational or institutional environments. And that's where sort of this algorithmic Judaism, we can coin that together here, you and I, I think is so appealing and so exciting. I want to go back to the question, though, talking about, Instagram, for example, is an interesting metaphor, because it's what do you want on your Instagram feed, but what do you not want on your Instagram feed, right? What do you want to unfollow or not see at all, right? Don't show me this ad again, type of thing. So like when we talked about the Jewish table, so to speak, we talked about some of the things that maybe you would like to stay on the table. What are some of the things in your mind that you feel should be taken off the table?
Yeah, well, one thing that I would say is that I'm not an advocate in this story. In other words, there's a Judaism that Dan Libenson, might prefer. But in my professional life, I'm actually not trying to create that Judaism. I'm trying to create a platform or a laboratory that many different possibilities can be explored. So I want to make that really clear because, for example, one of the things that I think is that a lot of Jews don't believe in God in the way that, let's say, not only Orthodox, but even Reform Judaism puts out ideas of God that I think many people in our world today just don't subscribe to and can't find meaning in that language. Now, I personally, sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. I'm not sure that I fall into that category, right? But what I'm saying is that I think that I can easily imagine a version of Judaism that we could call post-religious or post-theistic. Not atheistic necessarily, because I think that it's not a question of that it doesn't believe in God or that it doesn't believe in God. I think what I mean by it is one that doesn't place God in the center of it, that doesn't say that what Judaism is a God-focused thing in the world. And I think that a version of Judaism of that nature could potentially find a lot of interest among people, especially if it was not just, I think a lot of people, particularly religious people or people who do put God at the center of their Judaism, they imagine that a version of Judaism that didn't have God at the center would just be kind of some kind of thin cultural bagel eating, movie watching, whatever we want to put down of the things that you and I might like, but they imagine like that's all it is. And what I'm saying is like, no, I think that there is a way to basically reimagine, or I shouldn't say reimagine, I just like recover, reinvigorate. I don't know what the right verb is, but to take all the wisdom that is in all the Jewish sources and all the Jewish practices and look at some of the God language as the user interface that worked in a world where people were really believers in an older, in that older version of God. Just because the user interface breaks doesn't mean that what's behind the user interface is broken. And I think that there's a troubling, in my view, confusion in the Jewish world between what is the user interface and what is the actual core of Judaism. And I think that at least one of the actual cores of Judaism is this wisdom that's been passed on from one generation to the other, to the next. And the way that I tend to define wisdom is that wisdom is the kind of knowledge that generally we only can get through the school of hard knocks. But if you only get it through the school of hard knocks, you usually get it too late to when you need to use it. So in my life, for example, I think a lot about parenting wisdom that, I've learned a lot. My kids are teenagers now, and one of them's already off in college. And there's a lot of things that I know now that I wish I really knew as deeply 18, 19 years ago, and maybe I would have been a better parent. And it's a bummer that I didn't know it back then. And that's an example of something that I wish that I had been given through some kind of wisdom channel. And like, what are those how do we learn wisdom? I think we learn it through various things like text, laws, practices, stories, role models, mentors. There are all kinds of ways of passing wisdom along. And in my mind, one way that we can understand the Bible and the Talmud and other Jewish practices is as a vehicle for passing along wisdom. And in a world in which people really were very God-focused, then sometimes having God be the character that mouths that wisdom is the most effective way to get people to take the wisdom seriously. But actually in our time, it's exactly the opposite. If people think that this wisdom is only coming from God, they'll dismiss it. So to my mind, if the wisdom is really the important thing, then we need to find a new way to convey that wisdom. So just as one example, like I'm imagining a really serious, deep effort that will start, as all disruptive innovations do, with a worse version of Judaism, a poorer version of Judaism. It will always start that way. So it shouldn't be judged because it's not as good when it starts. So it has to be a long process. And a long process, I mean like a century, not 5 years. And what would a process look like that was working to reimagine and to re-present all of the Jewish wisdom from all of our different sources, but not through God language? And the last thing I just want to say to reinforce that is that I think that one could see that we have done this throughout Jewish history, that Judaism has always been, compared to the other religions of its society, atheistic, meaning that in a world where everybody believes in many gods, a community that believes only in one God is seen by them as atheists, right? I mean, like, what are you talking about? You don't believe in 99% of the gods. They didn't say, oh, but we still believe in one. They acknowledged that. They said, yeah, we actually have a different belief system as you, but we actually think that our one God is capable of conveying all the wisdom that up till now you have been conveying through many gods, right? And I think that we've continued that process over time. Instead of just having one God, now our God is abstract and doesn't have a body and is everywhere, right? It doesn't, right? Maimonides had a different view of God. And so I think that like we can sort of continue that process without people freaking out. So that's just one example. But again, I think it's a powerful one because I think people assume that it's at the very center of Judaism. I always like to tell the story that imagine that we were having a podcast like this and it was taking place in the year 50 or something while the Second Temple was still standing. And I was here trying to lobby for some kind of new Judaism that would involve synagogues and rabbis and study and all kinds of things. And you were, representing, the host was like a priest. And you were saying, yeah, okay, but when would the sacrifices take place? And I would say, no, in this new version of Judaism, there wouldn't be any sacrifices. And you're like, what are you talking about? The sacrifices is Judaism. Like that's the centerpiece of Judaism. You're saying there's going to be a Judaism with no sacrifices? That is crazy. That's a crazy thing to say. That would be a terrible Judaism. And in a certain sense, that critic would be right. But 2,000 years later, we understand that worst form of Judaism turned into something pretty complex, and now that people are fighting to the death to hold on to.
There's another good story that I recently heard about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, I think his name is, and he takes over the Beit Midrash, which is the study house. This is like 2nd century CE.
Yep.
And previously the Beit Midrash was under Rabban Gamliel, and he was a very strict rabbi, effectively, Gamliel, and he basically said, listen, only the most elite scholars can come and study Torah and study Jewishness and Judaism. Everyone else is not welcome. And he literally had a guard that would stand outside the Beit Midrash, and he would say, yes, you're in, no, you're not. Very exclusive and sort of club-like. So when Ben Azariah comes in, he says, no, everyone's welcome. He literally fires the guard. He has like 400, 500, 600 benches added to the Beit Midrash to accommodate a ton of different new students and who want to come and study. And there's a quote by Rabbi Jill Jacobs, I'm sure you know her, who says, on the day that the Beit Midrash was open to the masses, the most difficult problems were solved. That's according to the Talmud. So I just think what you're saying is, listen, we've had, a relatively small group of organizations determine how to be Jewish, where to be Jewish, etc. And we'd like to open that up and invite a lot more people to the table, including some of the quote unquote, more institutionalized folks. And it sounds like what you're saying, and I would agree with, is that sort of the most difficult problems of the existing modern Jewish world will be solved when we do that.
Yeah, can I give you, there's a part 2 of that story, which is really awesome and rarely focused on. So it's exactly like you said. So they threw out the guards at the gate, and actually, like they said, like 700, they just debated 400 or 700 new students flowed in. And then, like Jill Jacobs said, like then they solved every issue that was on the table in Beit Midrash that day. But the one example that the Talmud gives in that story is that there's a man who is somebody who's trying to convert to Judaism, but he's an Ammonite, meaning he's from what we now know as Jordan, Ammon and Moab, and he wants to become a Jew. And the Torah explicitly says in Deuteronomy that no Ammonite can ever become a member of the congregation of Israel. And that's reinforced in the book of Nehemiah, that no Ammonites and Moabites can become a member of the people of Israel. And in the Talmud, in that story, they actually find a way to allow this Ammonite to become a Jew, which says to me, the way I interpret that part of the story is that once you open up the gates, the first thing that the new people want to do is open up the gates even farther. And that's a scary thing, I think, for the people who think, for example, that gate opening is dangerous. And they're right that there's danger. And by the way, I would add a second, from there, I would put a second thing on the table that I think that one of the questions that I think in a new approach to Judaism would be on the table is, who is a Jew? And what does it mean to be a Jew? And there are debates, and there's actually been kind of a little Facebook debate over the last few days in America about whether it should be matrilineal or patrilineal and all that. And I would put a new idea on the table, that it should be nonlineal. In other words, that in a new version of Judaism, like, I could imagine that Judaism should be solely a choice that a person makes at some age. I would say it probably has to be bumped up from 13, maybe 18, 21, I don't know. But I imagine a period where no child is assumed to be Jewish. No child, it doesn't have to be a disappointment if they decide that they're not into it. And it doesn't have to be a great celebration if they decide that they are into it. It should just be an option that anybody can come at the age of 21 or older and say, I feel a connection to this thing, to this people, however you want to define it, and I'm opting in. And then there's no difference whether your parents were Jewish, one parent was Jewish, two parents were Jewish, or no parents were Jewish. It's not that kind of thing. It's not a club that you're in or out. It's a decision whether or not you want to be part of this project. I would find that to be a much more exciting version of Judaism, because in that version, you know that everybody's there because they want to be there. You mentioned it briefly. We recently launched this project called the Unyeshiva, which is a learning center. It's online largely. After COVID, we'll probably do some in-person stuff, but it's the first time I've been teaching classes in this, and it's the first time that I have taught a class that was not part of a program that somebody was already in, meaning, that they were in college and they had to take a class, and so they took my class or whatever, but I used to be a law professor. So, there are cases where they chose my class, or they were assigned to my class. And so they kind of want to be there, but they don't really, maybe they don't. This is a class where every single person who's in the room has actually paid to be there, and they didn't have to, and they're not part of a program where they have to take this class. And to teach a room full of people that are all there because they want to is an incredible experience that I would wish upon everybody who's out there who might, see themselves as a teacher. And so I just imagine that a Judaism in which everybody who is Jewish is part of it because they want to would be an extraordinary thing.
A lot to think about there. I'm curious to get your opinion about anti-Semitism. I'm actually writing an essay as we speak about sort of maybe a new way to approach the so-called fight against anti-Semitism. And I'm curious to know, I've spoken to a lot of people in the last few months who basically say anti-Semitism, it's there, it's real, but it's way overblown. It's not a Jewish problem, it's a non-Jewish problem. I've had somebody compare it to like a weed, meaning you can cut it off at the ground level, but it's just going to grow back eventually. And somebody who I think probably personally, Ben Freeman, who wrote the book Jewish Pride, says this is the reason, this sort of concept of anti-Semitism being a weed, it's the reason why historical attempts to defeat it have failed. That's a direct quote. I had a Eastern European retiree who's been living in the States in your neck of the woods for several years. She's the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She told me that the Holocaust is overstated and ineffective when it comes to dealing with anti-Semitism. Kenneth Stern, who you might know, who's the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, says that, people usually try to use Holocaust education to somehow fight anti-Semitism. And he says it's important to know about the Holocaust, of course, but teaching about the Wannsee Conference or Kristallnacht, it's not really going to change how people perceive anti-Semitism and how they connect to it. I had a Toronto-based Jewish donor tell me that you can't fight anti-Semitism, you can't cure it, you can't fix it. You have to have a strong Jewish identity and a strong Zionist identity. Otherwise, all the fighting against anti-Semitism doesn't matter, so on and so forth. I'm curious to hear from you, like, in this sort of new version or new versions with an S at the end of Judaism that we've been talking about, How do you see anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism and the growth or the decline of anti-Semitism in your purview?
It's funny. It reminds me a little bit. I once gave a talk to. I was working on campus, and like some kind of evangelical Christian organization invited me to give a talk about Judaism there, and I talked for half an hour or whatever about Judaism from my perspective, as a Jew, and then there was a Q&A period, and they started asking me like all these questions about the Messiah. What do we believe about the Messiah and this and that, the Messiah. After like 15 minutes of this, I said to them like, I've thought more about the Messiah in the last 15 minutes than I probably have in the last 10 years. It's just not something that's at the top of my list of things to think about. And I would say that anti-Semitism, I kind of feel similar in the sense that I am so focused on wanting to imagine a Judaism that people, especially Jews, but I mean, also I'm just as happy to welcome non-Jews, to become Jewish or to be, sort of Jewish, whatever they want to be, to be part of this. But I'm so focused on trying to bring about a situation where there would be a Judaism that people would want to love, that I'm not really so focused on the question of those who don't love it or hate it. Not to make small of it. I mean, like it may or may not be an important problem, and I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, I have my doubts, but I really feel like it's not my main area of expertise and focus, because I just feel like if the efforts that we put into fighting anti-Semitism were put into imagining a Judaism that Jews would love, I actually think we would be in a much better situation. So that's what I've chosen to devote my life to doing. But I respect others doing otherwise. I also think it's important to distinguish between kinds of anti-Semitism. I also think like sometimes people talk about anti-Semitism as if it's this like spiritual, it's almost like built into the fabric of the universe. It's like and I don't know, like that's not how I think about things, but I mean, sometimes some of that language, like it's a weed, it'll always come, you can't fight it. I mean, like, I don't know, like, why is that? Is it because it's just some kind of spiritual thing built into the fabric of nature, or is it because of something else? So like, I'm sometimes a little bit confused about that. That's just a question that I have. In terms of, fighting anti-Semitism and everything. I mean, I kind of think there's at least three categories that we should put things into. One is like people who don't have the highest opinion of Jews or Judaism in some way, but they don't want to kill Jews. They don't want to harm Jews. They just, maybe have like attitudes that are unfortunate, and I want them to change those attitudes. But that is different from people who are out there wanting to kill Jews. And you could say that one leads to the other, and sometimes maybe it does. And I don't make it light. I don't take it lightly. But I think for the most part, those are two different phenomena. Now, I am a person who believes in, microaggressions when we're talking about race and stuff. So again, I take seriously the world of the people who have internalized negative views about Judaism, including many Christians, because that's built into the fabric of Christianity from the very beginning. So it's no surprise that sometimes bad ideas will be absorbed. But nevertheless, like most people I know and have met that have some version of an internalized, what you could call anti-Semitism, they don't actually want to harm Jews. They just have a misunderstanding, or they a negative view of something, and are open to talking about it. So those are two different categories. I think it's really important to distinguish. And I think the number of people that are actually excited to kill Jews want to go around, I don't think that's actually a very large number. It used to be. And so I think that to fail to see that the world has gotten better on that score, or certainly the Western world has gotten better on that score, is something that if we refuse to see that, then I think we're refusing to see the world as it is. And then the third category is anti-Zionism or anti-Israel kind of stuff that people will label as anti-Semitism, ipso facto, by definition. And again, I think sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But if you are focused there, then you're going to, and if you believe that all opposition to Israel or much opposition to Israel is anti-Semitism by definition, then you're going to be seeing a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. And I don't see it that way, but again, I think people can, but I think it's important to make those distinctions.
I want to talk to you about Israel. It's a good segue because, when I was first introduced to you, I think I just heard about your podcast or whatever. This was a few years ago. I never told you this, by the way. So, on the record, I just thought, oh, another young, smart, intellectual, liberal, progressive Jew trying to reimagine, reinvigorate, reinvent. And by the way, I agree with a lot of the stuff that I saw back then. There's so much depth and nuance and context with you as with everyone, but I'm curious, like, I know that you're creating a platform and therefore you're allowing multiple viewpoints and multiple opinions and intersecting and complex and all that kind of stuff. But like, because the whole concept of Israel, it's become a very hot button issue. You know that more than I do. Your father effectively is Israeli, from my understanding. You lived in Israel. You made Aliyah, as you said. How do, like, just in your community up until today, maybe not looking into the future, but like in the community that you, my understanding is you have a very vibrant and engaged community. What are some of the opinions, thoughts, perspectives about Israel/Zionism, and how do you see that sort of moving forward with the multiple versions of Judaism that you would like to see?
Well, the first thing that I think it's really worth saying is that in the world of the Judaism that I travel in and that I'm trying to catalyze, I actually think that mostly people see it the way that I described it earlier in terms of my thinking about Israel and about my thinking of anti-Semitism. So I was talking about anti-Semitism, but I would say the same thing about Israel. I just think that it's not top of mind. In other words, I think that the view from Israel is that Israel is the most important element in being Jewish, or maybe number 2 or number 3, but it's right up there. Whereas I would say that for most of the kind of American Jews, less affiliated, whatever you want to call them, less affiliated with mainstream institutions, I just don't think that Israel is particularly central one way or the other to their Judaism. It's not, what they're looking for is a way to be Jewish in America or wherever they live in the world that's meaningful to them.
So I want to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, but I want to ask you about that. Because to me, it's very clear that the fact that you and I can be having conversations about versions of future Judaism and algorithmic Judaism, and that Jews in America, for example, want to be American Jews or Jewish Americans, and that Israel is not top of mind. That is only enabled, in my view at least, by the fact that there is a Jewish country that is independent, obviously has a very strong military and can fend after itself, has great relationships with, for example, the US government and, the UK and France and other countries around the world. But like, to me, I feel that a lot of American Jews and Jews around the world outside of Israel, outside of America as well, that's what they don't understand, is that you can go and be your Jewish self wherever you are because of Israel, not in spite of Israel. And so this idea that it's not top of mind to me feels bizarre, because I'm not saying that an American Jew or an Australian Jew or a Chinese Jew should wake up every day and, spend 30 minutes praying that there's Israel. I'm not saying that at all. But to go to the opposite side of the spectrum, which is basically, yeah, it's this country sort of far off in the wherever it is, and maybe I've been there, maybe I haven't, maybe I'll go, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll have an opinion about it one way or another, maybe I won't. Like, to me, that seems just awkward. I'm trying to understand how you see it, because to me, it's very clear that you can be Jewish openly and proudly and in the ways that you want to be anywhere in the world because of Israel, period.
I mean, it's a counterfactual that's hard to really debate because we don't know. We haven't experienced the alternate universe.
We have experienced it.
No, we experienced it a long time ago. In other words, we haven't experienced it in this year.
Right. You and I haven't, right? These people of this generation.
No, but I mean, I don't think that, I think that that's a little bit of a a wrong-headed approach to say, we experienced it, a century ago. I mean, I think that we don't know what it would be like in the post, in the post World War II. I don't mean the Holocaust, I mean World War II. In the sort of the last century, we just don't know. So I think it's possible. I'm not saying that what you're saying is not possible, but I'm saying I don't think that we can say that's definitely true. So I think that, and the main point though is that I don't think that that's what these American Jews think. I don't think that I think that if you would ask them, do you think that you're only able to be Jewish in the way that you want, et cetera, because Israel exists? I don't think that they would think so. I think they would say, no, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with that we're in America, and America's, a free country, and, whatever.
Well, so is Germany. So, I mean,
again, I don't think that I don't think that we can make a comparison to another period in history and be certain of it, right? In other words, I'm not saying that the comparisons have no meaning and no value. I'm just saying that I think we can't be as easy to say, yeah, we know how this happens. I don't think that we know.
but isn't it?
But in any event, my point is whether you think you know or I think I know, they don't think this is true. Like they don't agree with you. So I think that their experience of the world is not that. And so they, so they just don't see that connection.
But shouldn't we help them make that connection? And shouldn't Israel do a better job? For example, I mean, I've been a big critic of Israel. In my first book, Reimagining Israel, I talk about how basically the Israeli government, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, etc., has in many cases dropped the ball on developing relationships with Jews around the world, with the rest of the world at large. Like, isn't it incumbent on people like you and me who do have platforms, albeit small or big or medium sized, to deliver a sort of education, if you will, that says, don't take being Jewish for granted and how you know it today or how you've known it your whole life. A lot of why we can be free and why you can truly be an open and proud Jew, unlike just a few generations ago, they couldn't. Otherwise, they were kind of scared. I mean, think about it. You and I would be too. I know a lot of people, by the way, that are scared today to be openly Jewish because of sort of the uptick in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic activity around the world. But I think, like, you and I are talking about people that are basically sheltered in a bubble of some sort that maybe haven't had any direct anti-Semitic attacks on them. I still think that you and I and sort of anyone today that has a platform, which is basically everyone, right, with social media and the internet, like, to me, it just feels that we have to, it's not about pushing an agenda, and it's not about not being critical of Israel, because I'm very critical of Israel in many ways, politically, socially, religiously, etc. But like, it just feels weird to me that you and I can be having this conversation and not be grateful and thankful that I would say a large part, you might say a lesser part, a certain part is attributed to the fact that we have a strong, independent Jewish state.
Well, first of all, I'd say that I mean, people just have a limited bandwidth of what they can do, and not like, and I mean, to me, there's two factors. One is, how certain are you? You seem extremely certain. I'm less certain. If I felt like you and I was extremely certain, then that would be a factor in saying, yeah, I should use my platform to promote this idea, because it's really, I feel very certain about other things, that I use my platform to promote, so I think that's fair. And number two is, like, people realistically, on whatever, if they're we all have a platform, but those of us who have a platform that's more of a platform than others, I mean, like, I still think you only have, like, realistically, you have limited bandwidth of what you can do. And it just sort of feels like, right, the more I talk about the Messiah, the less I'm going to talk about, the parts of Judaism that I think are more significant for this audience, right? So it's just kind of like, on the substance of what you're saying, though, I just feel like, I feel like, sure, could Israel have done a better job of making this case? Yeah, I mean, no question about it. How they would do it exactly, I don't know. So I just think that, like, to me, it's like, I kind of think about the creation of something, like I think about it as like a primordial soup. Like I have this dream one day that there would be a Jewish Burning Man kind of experience, that whoever wanted to would come, and all the different ideas would be there, and they would just be running into each other. And then like in that atmosphere, these molecules would smash into each other and recombine. Somebody would say, I don't know, when I was a kid, there were these ads for Reese's peanut butter cups where someone was walking along with a chocolate bar and someone was walking along with a tub of peanut butter, and they bumped into each other and the chocolate fell in the peanut butter, and then the person pulled it out and ate it and was like, oh, this is better. Like, and so that's how Reese's peanut butter cups were formed. And so like I kind of imagine like, yeah, so let's create a marketplace of ideas. The realistic thing is that the people who feel most passionately about this or that idea are the ones who are going to prioritize it on their platform or in their life. And the question to me is, for those of us trying to create a sort of a more of a laboratory platform, is how can we cause all those different ideas to run into each other in their most powerful and well constructed way, and then let's see what happens. Like I kind of trust the brain power of people, that they can hear the argument that you're making about that Israel is the reason why we are able to have this ability to even explore this question of like, what kind of Judaism do we want, like to hear it and evaluate it and decide if it speaks to them, and they will or they won't. So like I just feel like we should be more I'll say like that when we did a series of episodes on Israel on Judaism Unbound, and one of the things that I walked away from that experience feeling the most strongly about was that we shouldn't have red lines about who's allowed to be in public conversations about Israel or anything. Not just Israel. I mean, I'm saying I'm treating Israel exactly the same as I treat any subject. We just did a series on circumcision recently, where we had people talking about why they thought it wasn't right to do circumcision anymore. So my point is that I'm not afraid of any arguments, and I don't think that we should be, and I don't think that it's the Jewish tradition to be afraid of any arguments. So the question is, instead of trying to police one another, could we just trust that the person I'm talking to is a smart person, motivated by good motivations? The thing that I hate the most, I hate a lot of things, but one of the things that I hate the most is calling other Jews anti-Semites. I hate it, because I fundamentally don't believe that almost any Jew, Bobby Fischer, for example, is an example of, I think he's proud to call himself an anti-Semite, the chess champion, Bobby Fischer. But other than him, very few Jews go around saying, like, I'm an anti-Semite, or believing that they are. I think that they truly believe that what they are saying is the best thing for the Judaism that they aspire to have. And you might think that they're wrong-headed, and you might think that if everybody follows them, it's going to lead us into some horrible future. So make a better argument, but don't try to say that they're not allowed to speak at our organization. What are you afraid of? I taught at a Catholic law school for 3 years, and one of my Catholic colleagues took the position that there should never be a pro-choice speaker invited to speak at the law school. Never mind the fact that half the faculty was pro-choice, but that's another situation. But I don't think she liked that fact. But she said we should never invite a pro-choice speaker to speak. And I said, I am actually pro-choice, so I'm just engaging in this to sort of be a helpful friend to you. But don't you think that the best strategy for you would be to have the best possible pro-choice speaker you could imagine come and speak on the first week of law school and make the best case for this position, and then you would have 3 years to make your arguments against it? Instead, you're causing a situation where this person is going to be here for 3 years, never hear an argument for this position that you disagree with, and then you expect that they're going to graduate from here and go out into the world, and the first time they're going to hear this strong position, there's going to be no one around to make the counter case. You think that's going to be more likely to lead to the world that you're trying to create? I think we're more likely to bring about the world that we're trying to create by not being afraid.
Yeah, you make some interesting points. I think my whole thing is this. For me, it's very clear that Israel is the Jewish capital of the world. And I make the comparison, like every capital, you have life in the capital and you have life outside the capital. You have Washington, D.C., which is vital to the story of America and the present day of America. And you have way more land and people that don't live in the capital, that don't engage with the capital, that maybe have never even been to the capital. And yet they all agree that the fact is Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with the people that are in political power or with, certain Supreme Court decisions. Two very different things. I sort of paint the same picture with Judaism, and I think that that's important for American Jews to realize for two reasons. One, the biggest population of Jews in the world lives in Israel today. That might change. It might swing toward the U.S., but then the second biggest would live in Israel. And I would also say that, when you look at is like Israeli Judaism. And when I say Israeli Judaism, I don't just mean the religious aspects, but like Israel as a culture and as a people, his society and history has a lot to offer to the world that can benefit, like being aligned with Israeli culture, history, society, etc. Can benefit, like, for example, anti-Semitism and other things in Jewish communities around the world. And I would say the same thing, by the way, that the Israelis have to do a better job of doing, is getting to know their Jewish friends around the world, whether it be in the States or Europe or Asia or whatever, and creating a true bidirectional relationship where each can lean on the other, both can bring their sort of unique value propositions, and then together we can have real relationships at scale, macro and micro, while also understanding that we don't have to agree on everything, that just because you are Jewish doesn't mean you have to move to Israel. Just because you live in Israel doesn't mean that you have to necessarily agree with how certain Jews do things around the world. But there's a true sense of appreciation, which I think is missing. And I know we see that in other places in life today. For example, I know in US politics, it's very divided and there's no real appreciation for the other anymore, it seems, at least from the outside looking in. That's the only thing I'm saying. Do you have any comments before we move on to something else?
Yeah, I do, because I think that I agree with much of what you're saying. Like, for example, I translated an Israeli novel by Yochi Brandis, one of the foremost novelists in Israel. I translated that into English precisely because I thought that that was a story that would only be told in Israel, and that it was important for all Jews to have access to it. So I agree with you that there are things that will only happen in Israel. I'm glad that there's an Israel. I'm glad that those things can happen. The one thing that I'd take issue with, I don't agree that Israel is the capital of the Jewish people. And I don't think it's necessary to say that. I think that to me is like you're putting a stake in the ground that I think realistically the vast majority of American Jews will not ever accept. And so by asserting that, I feel like you put us on a path for a schism, because I think that if at the end of the day you have to sign on to this is capital, but I don't want to live there. I don't agree with what's going, like that I have to not only say that exists, but I don't agree with it, but I have to say that's the capital. Like that somehow I'm in a lesser place. And, that I think that people just won't accept that. So you can say, well, that's okay. They don't have to accept it. It's the truth, but I think that the result of that will be that we will find, and this might happen anyway, that we will end up dividing into two communities, one of which sees Israel as central and one of which doesn't. And the one that doesn't necessarily hate Israel. They just don't see it as central, or they don't see it as the center. And I would just ask you to like transpose what you're saying. How would you hear that if, and they do, an Orthodox person says, the centerpiece of Judaism is worship of the Holy One, and everybody has to acknowledge that. I mean, that has always been the center of Judaism. And yeah, there's other kinds of Judaism and it's okay and whatever, but like at the end of the day, you have to accept that this
Well,
is where
I
the
don't
center
I don't
really
buy
is.
that. I'll push back on that because first of all, I had a great Orthodox Jewish woman on the podcast who basically said, "Listen, I live for God. I have a very authentic relationship with God." This is what she was saying, by the way. Not all Jews have to have that same relationship or any relationship. At the end of the day, there's other things that can bind us. So I'm not sure I
I'm not
buy
saying
that. I
every
think
Orthodox person would say it. I'm saying the ones who do say it are,
right,
to
but like
me, you would take issue with that.
there are some clear benefits. Always advantages and disadvantages to everything, but there are some very clear benefits that don't seem to be replicatable without a so-called capital. I mean, I'll just give you a very simple one. Most people don't realize, but the Mossad has departments, right? The Israeli CIA has departments which literally are tasked with looking after Jewish communities around the world, right? And obviously it's all discreet, undercover. If you didn't know that, you would probably never know that unless you heard it from me or maybe read it in a newspaper, but like, it's not like they advertise that. If there's no Jewish capital, if basically what we're saying is that Israel's just another country and good luck either way, then to me, I'm saying, okay, well, who's going to look after Jewish communities around the world? When we know historically, I mean, it's nice to say, well, we don't really know what would happen, but it's also a fact that history happened not over a few years, over 3,000, 4,000 years. I mean, that's a significant sample size to look back and say, listen, it's nice that we have a country whose intelligence agency and security forces in part look after Jews around the world, not just those living in the capital. So like, that's one example. I just feel that, and again, I want to be very clear, it's a two-way street. It's not that Jews have to pledge allegiance, non-Israeli Jews, I should say, have to pledge allegiance to Israel, period, and nothing else matters. That's not what I'm saying. It's a two-way street. Israel has to do a much better job of engaging both Jews and the greater world in what it means to be the quote-unquote Jewish capital. But it is a two-way street. Jews around the world, whether they choose to be Jewish, as we talked about before, they were born Jewish or a combination of both, like, for somebody to engage, the other person has to want to be engaged. And so I do feel that both sides have to do a better job. And to me, it's like, you say, well, if I don't live in the capital, I live in a lesser place. I grew up in California. I've been to Washington, D.C. literally one time in my life. I never thought for a second that California or me living there was me living in a lesser place than Washington, D.C. But I never once questioned that Washington, D.C. was the capital of the United States. So to me, I'm just trying to understand, for somebody like you who has this audience and platform of a very clearly diverse and eclectic group of people, like, I'm just not sure I'm buying what you're saying. What do you have to say to that?
Well, what I'm primarily trying to say is that I don't think that the people will ever buy what you're saying. Right? Another. So I'm starting with not trying to make a judgment one way or the other about what you're saying. I happen not to agree with it. I mean, I want to make that clear. But my main point is that I don't think that the vast majority of American Jews will ever agree with that. So the question is, what are we supposed to do about that? And I would prefer a relationship in which we don't have to, assert that this one is the capital or that one is more important, less important, doing this things for you, I'm doing this for you, why aren't you grateful, why, et cetera. Like, I just don't think that that's like a good way to have a relationship. I think like a better way to have a relationship is just to, say, actually we're different places, different communities. Like, let's just talk to each other. I just don't see the value of putting terminology like that onto it. I don't think it helps.
Fair enough. Let's move on to a few other topics before we wrap up here. You're somebody who is, I wouldn't use the word controversial, but I think if you looked at like a traditional conservative person in the Jewish world, they might call you like controversial or unconventional or just a little bit outside the box, which is a good thing, by the way, in my opinion. I want to know, in your opinion, in your mind, from your perspective, what's the number one thing that you feel most people get wrong about you, and what's the actual truth there?
It's so funny. Like, one thing is, like, I feel like I'm much less controversial than I sort of sometimes wish I was. Like, I wish that we got more negative feedback, because then I sometimes I feel like we're not being clear enough about what we're saying, because if we were, then more people would think we're controversial. So I don't really know. Like the truth is that one of the things that I've discovered is that what we are about is much less controversial than one would think. And there are a lot of people, we get a lot of emails and conversations from rabbis and other people that are basically saying like, yeah, they agree with us. And so then I'm kind of like, well, then why aren't you doing more to sort of move things in this direction? And they say, well, it's like I've gotten myself stuck in a situation where I've got, a salary and a pension and whatever, all of which I respect. I don't mean to, I just think that that's part of the thing, that the old system has a very strong gravitational pull. It's very hard to break away from it. And frankly, I don't, I once got fired by the Chicago Federation. I don't know that I would have broken away myself. It's like one of those situations where I was broken away from, and that was actually a gift to me, it turned out. But what I wish that people would, sort of understand more about me, I guess. I mean, I don't feel like I don't feel hard done by in any way. I feel like I've been very lucky to have been able to have a platform where I can be pretty clear about, who I am and who we are. But the one thing that I would say to people who don't really know, who've never listened to our stuff or never really, is that like we are the opposite of Judaism light. We take the raw materials of Judaism so seriously. We've created this yeshiva in part, like we studied text. We are so focused on that Judaism, that if I could describe the problem, and this is where I would go back to Marie Kondo. There was an amazing show. She had a show on Netflix, Marie Kondo, the tidying up expert. And it was this amazing episode where she's helping this family that happens to be Japanese American, and they're tidying up their home. And it turns out that underneath all the piles of, I shouldn't say crap, because it actually was like really good stuff, but they were just kind of hoarders. They had a lot of stuff, but it was really good stuff. But as they neatened it up, as they tidied it up and they got rid of stuff, they found this whole nother layer of stuff in the house that had belonged to the parents of the man of this couple, and that were like from Japan. And there were these like amazing things that they never really knew that they had. And it was because this enormous amount of new stuff had accumulated on top of it. And so the idea of like stripping down and tidying up and being very conscious of what we're keeping and what we're putting on the back burner actually has the potential to reveal the great treasures that we had. So the thing that I really want to claim is that our process of being open to change and even radical change, but doing so through an approach that says, but we approach every component of Judaism with love. Approaching it with love doesn't necessarily mean we're going to keep it at the end, but it doesn't mean that we're acting cavalierly toward it. That gives us a chance, and I think we have already discovered many treasures that the more mainstream or traditional Jewish world has long forgotten. And so I think that and by the way, I would say that is part of why I, again, get back to making these connections about red lines and not wanting to exclude anybody from the conversation, because I think that many people have great treasures to bring to us, and we screen them out. Like you were telling the story about Rabban Gamliel and Elazar ben Azariah, we keep them out at our own peril. One of the things that Rabban Gamliel says when he realizes that all these people have streamed into the Beit Midrash, the Talmud says that he kind of he became depressed, and he said, perhaps I've withheld the Torah from Israel. And so there's like two elements of it. Like one is by keeping people out, we are denying them the opportunity to connect to this stuff, whatever it is, including Israel. By keeping people out of the conversation about Israel who have views that we disagree with, we're preventing them from actually maybe hearing views that they might change their minds. So that's what I was also saying about the Catholic law school, right? So there's that. And also we are denying ourselves the ability to gain from what they're bringing. And that's that main part of the story where every open question in the Beit Midrash was solved on that day. So So I kind of feel like that's what I want to make sure is clear about what we're doing, is that we're trying to do that, and we're not trying to. We don't imagine. I don't imagine. Back to the disruptive innovation. The whole point of disruptive innovation is that one day the new product becomes better than the old product ever was, and has orders of magnitude more customers, so to speak, than the old product could have ever had. And that also is true of Jewish history. When we have had these times of great change, on the other end of them, I think it's hard to say that the new version of Judaism is in any way deficient as compared to the old version of Judaism. And there are many, many more Jews. So that's what I hope we'll achieve again together.
I'm curious to know, I know we just have a few more minutes coming up here, but I'm curious to know, like, how do you see the role of the rabbi, which I know it's a different role for different rabbis and in different countries and different communities, but like generally speaking, top down speaking, like what's in sort of this new version or new versions of Judaism that we've discussed, what's the role of the rabbi?
In a new form of Judaism, the role of the rabbi would be to be determined, because there might not be one, right? In other words, what's the role of the priest in our version of Judaism? It's kind of an honorary role, but the priest is by genetics, by birth. So we can't really get rid of the priests, so it's like, okay, what do? We honor them. Rabbis is an office of choice. So it's possible that there wouldn't be that office anymore. That's possible. I don't know if the question is the rabbi office itself, or in other words, we're going to have leaders in the next version of Judaism. We could call them rabbis, or we could call them something else. So what are we talking about when we say rabbi? That the rabbinic role has changed too. I mean, I think for most of the history of rabbinic Judaism, what a rabbi was more of a teacher. Only in the last 100 or 200 years has rabbi become seen to be like a clergy member. And so could it be that we'll return to the old version of a rabbi? Very possibly. I would like that. I personally think that there's some value to not calling it a rabbi, because I think that if you use the same language as the previous version, then you get confused about which version you're in. So, that said, I would say one other thing, though. If we're using this analogy that we're in some process of, or metaphor, that we're in some process of, the exodus from Egypt and wandering in the wilderness for a while until we discover the new version of Judaism, and then we'll go to the promised land, that I think that a role of rabbi today would be to help the people today who really need rabbis, to help them leave Egypt. In other words, to help them know that there's a future that may not have rabbis in it, but that's okay. And by the way, there are a lot of rabbis that are doing that. There are a lot of rabbis that are really consciously doing it. I know that because I get emails from them. And so I'm not trying to disparage the office of rabbi by saying that maybe the rabbi's role for the next century is to lead us to a future where rabbis will be less central, or there won't be rabbis, or the term will have changed. So, I would say stuff like that.
Last question for you. We briefly talked about your podcast, but if you haven't listened to his podcast, it's one of the top podcasts in the Jewish world. It's called Judaism Unbound. You guys have over 300 episodes from what I understand. Just talk to us for a few minutes about what that journey's been like. I mean, 300, that's a big number. I know you probably want to double, triple, quadruple that, in the next certain period of time. But, what are some of the things that have really stuck out throughout this process, becoming one of the top podcasts in the Jewish world? And what do you want people to get from it?
Well, the way that we've always seen the podcast is that once you accept, and I mean, anybody's invited to listen, you don't have to sign on the dotted line in order to listen to the podcast, but to the extent that you accept that we're in some process of transition and we're moving from version 3.0 to 4.0 of Judaism, the podcast is trying to surface what are some of the big ideas and thoughts and experiments that are out there already that are potentially significant to that process of transition or to that next version of Judaism. And That's kind of what in my mind at least it's for. That's its mission. That doesn't mean that every episode is always doing that, because sometimes we talk to somebody and it turns out, oh, this idea that we thought was huge actually isn't so big, or the person. What often happens is that the person themselves doesn't see the potential of their own idea, which is often frustrating to me. And so I don't know, like one day, some that's again why I really excited about this idea of like a Burning Man, where all these ideas could encounter one another, because I think often and by the way, Kodak invented the digital photography chip. They just didn't know how to take it to market. So somebody else came along and figured out how to. So I think that's true of a lot of these new Jewish ideas that are out there. The originator of the idea is not necessarily the right person to bring it to its final form. And
sounds a little bit like Herzl in the state of Israel, does it not?
Possibly so. Yeah. I mean, Herzl, that could be a whole nother podcast. I to read The Jewish State. I mean, when I read the book, I was like, oh wow, this is like how I love this way of thinking. Not just about the subject, but just the utopianism of it. I'm like, oh, just the dreaming. The idea that somebody was willing to dream like this and put it into writing. It just had such an appeal to me. So I'll give you one example of like one of these, and this was an early episode of ours that really like blew my mind. There's this guy named Juan Mejia. He's a rabbi. He comes from Colombia, the country. He grew up Catholic. He found that he had Jewish ancestry, and eventually he converted to Judaism, officially, and became a conservative rabbi. And then started to realize like people like him in Latin America didn't have access to Jewish books and Jewish ideas. So he started to create these YouTube videos teaching Judaism in Spanish, and eventually this was meant for people who had Jewish ancestry and wanted to become, fully convert to Judaism. And then people started to get in touch with him that said, I don't have any Jewish ancestry, but I came across your Spanish videos about Judaism and I love it and I want to become Jewish, And he at a certain point said, well, why should I say no? I mean, a person wants to be Jewish. And this is, a lot of my thinking that I talked about earlier in today's podcast, this idea of non-lineal transmission of Judaism, the idea that Judaism should be a choice. It kind of flows from that. So that was one of those examples of one of these episodes that just changed the way I'm thinking. And I'm still challenged to think about it today. And the one piece to me was like, oh my gosh, this is Juan Mejia. Imagine what happens when the Juan Mejia of China comes along, right? And puts this stuff out in Chinese. And what would happen if 1% of the population of China wanted to become Jewish? That would be more Jews than there are today. Would you be happy about that? Is that something that you want? And I think that the question about like, can we imagine a world in which the people who are the Jews are so different from the people who are the Jews today? And of course, that will bring along changes to the nature of Judaism. If it were to be emerging out of Chinese culture, how different would it be, right? And if we can look at all that and say, hey, that would be an exciting thing to happen, then I kind of feel like you're a Judaism Unbound person. If you would kind of look at that and say, I don't know about that, then I think you should still listen, but you might not like it.
Well, I think you made the point earlier in the episode, which is that we've always adapted and evolved, and the Jews of 2,000 years ago don't look like the Jews today and probably won't look like the Jews in 2,000 years. So with that said, Dan, thank you so much for doing this. You are really a fascinating person doing some great things in the Jewish world. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.